Hi everyone, my name is Alex Covery and I'm the Nature Center Manager with the Palos Verdes Peninsula Land Conservancy. I manage White Point Nature Center and George F. Canyon Nature Center, and one of my roles here is to oversee the care of our education animals. And today I'm going to give you a quick tour of some of them, and we're going to get some up close and personal meet and greets with each of them. So I hope you enjoy. Although our nature centers are closed at the moment, our trails remain open, so they are available for you and your family to explore. All right, so this is our first education animal. His name is Julius Squeezer, and he is a California king snake. And you'll notice he has a really beautiful pattern, a kind of chocolatey and cream-colored stripes that are iconic to our local king snakes. One special adaptation that California king snakes have is that they are actually immune to rattlesnake venom. So in the wild, rattlesnakes are one of their main sources of food. So they are great at attacking and eating them. They are constrictors. So he can actually unhinge his jaw to swallow his prey whole, and he'll squeeze tightly around it to catch it. So this is our next education animal. His name is Crate, and he is a three-toed box turtle. Three-toed box turtles are not native to California. He's actually from the southeastern United States, but he does play a really important role in teaching our students about the importance of keeping our waters clean and healthy for our local endangered turtles, like the southwestern pond turtle. Here is our alligator lizard. Her name is Allizardbeth, and she is one of our local species of lizards that lives here on the peninsula. One interesting characteristic that alligator lizards have is their kind of sharp, pointed, triangular face, and they also have extremely long tails. You can see her tail is a lot longer than the rest of her body. And when they move on the trail, usually folks will mistake them for a snake because they will move quickly and they have that long body shape and tail, and they'll move in an S pattern. This is our other California king snake, Miss Penny. And Miss Penny has a slightly different pattern than Julius Squeezer does. You can see that she is a more yellowish tone with a lighter brown stripe. And that pattern is more closely associated with California king snakes who are not local to the peninsula, but closer to our eastern mountain ranges.
Welcome to the George F. Canyon Nature Preserve. This preserve gives us 51 acres of land that is maintained and restored by the Palos Verdes Peninsula Land Conservancy. It's located in Rolling Hills Estates at the intersection of Palos Verdes Drive North and Palos Verdes Drive East. And Alan, it's been a preserve since?
In the 90s, I think the mid-90s, so back in the last millennium.
Yes.
It was set aside.
Yes, and it was set aside through the generous donation of the Stein and Hale families, after which the main trail through the preserve is named. It's easy not to get lost. There's one trail that goes up to the top of the preserve. It's a mile long, and then we have an extension of another 0.8 of a mile that takes you to an amazing viewpoint where another 15 acres was added in 2016 through the generous donation of other families. So what do you think we'll see here today, Alan?
Well, the really remarkable thing about this site is it's the best riparian habitat probably that we've got left on the peninsula. George F. Canyon is centered around a creek, which goes nearly to the highest point on the peninsula and has eaten its way down into the hillside of the peninsula as the peninsula has risen. So the peninsula actually was below sea level 1 million years ago or thereabouts, and is rising at a rate of 1 or 2 millimeters a year, and that adds up over time. So as the peninsula has risen up from the seafloor to becoming an island to becoming a peninsula, its slopes have steepened, and rainwater running off and spring water coming out from the sides of the hill have eaten into the sediments in the peninsula, and we have canyons like this as a result. Now, where the drainage water has found less resistance, it's carved canyons, and this is the Grand Canyon of the peninsula in many regards, not to be confused with the one in Arizona. Because of the erosion and the groundwater, even though we won't see water in the creek bed today, there is groundwater below it, and that's what feeds this luxurious growth here, which provides habitat for reptiles and insects and birds. So as we go along, we will probably hear quite a range of birds. Even though it's been a dry year to this point, there are still bugs for birds to eat, and there are berries on plants like toyon. So there is ecology going on, and we'll hopefully be able to see that as we enjoy our walk this morning.
Alan, we have a flourishing green plant here.
Well, this is one of our natives. This is stinging nettle, and it's a plant that's both a peril and a product that people can use. The stem in particular of this plant is, during the growing season in particular, covered with little needles, which are effectively hypodermics. And it injects you with formic acid, the same stuff that biting red ants inject. So you get the same stinging effect from accidentally brushing against a stinging nettle that you would get if you had a swarm of red ants on your hand or your leg or whatever body part brushed against it. Well, that's not a particularly useful feature of this plant. It turns out that it also has a very useful fiber, and actually for millennia, for many generations, native people use the stems after they're dried out. So we can find an example like this, where it takes considerable force to tear it. And the fibers are very strong, and they could be used for netting and basketry and twine and things like that. So it was a very useful plant to have for people for a long time. So I'm pulling as hard as I can, and I can't pull that apart. And if you twist it and twine it, you can make a good rope for any of a variety of purposes.
Now, how are you able to handle that?
When the plant is dry, the formic acid has no medium to deliver it. So it's safe for me to touch this, but I wouldn't want to touch that right there where it's green.
So, Alan, what have we here on our happy willow leaf?
Well, the willow is, again, one of the dominant riparian trees, one of the dominant forms of vegetation and riparian habitat all up and down California. And actually, you can find willows up into Alaska, except they're little tiny, stunted willows. These willows here, mostly red and yellow willows, provide habitat to lots and lots of insects and birds and other creatures. And one of the ways that we can see that is actually in these warty-looking things. These are galls. This is where insects have laid their eggs in the leaf of this willow. And when the eggs hatch, the larvae will actually feed on the tissue of the willow until they're ready to erupt from the leaf and fly off into their next stage in life. So the willow supports a variety of stages of life for dozens of different varieties of insects, and provides habitat for spiders that eat those insects, and birds that eat the spiders and the bugs, and lizards that eat everything but the birds. So we've got a rich habitat. I don't know if you can hear the birds singing up ahead, but it's a productive habitat. And again, it's because of the stream and the water. So this is a unique habitat for the Palos Verdes Peninsula. We have precious little riparian habitat, and this is some of the best of it. So a good reason to come to George F. Canyon.
We have two plants in the canyon that look very much alike. One of them is innocuous and the other one is dangerous. This one, unfortunately, the one that has the thorns on it, the blackberry plant, is actually the innocuous one, but its leaves are very similar to poison oak, which we'll see in great abundance further up the trail. Looks very similar, but it lacks the thorns to warn you to stay away from it, and you don't want to have an interaction with the poison oak.
One of the things that we might mention too in connection with the blackberry. It's just leaves and stems as we look at it now because it's the end of the dry season. But if you come back after we've had some rain, it'll have beautiful white flowers, which will turn into blackberries. So the plant will look more varied and attractive in a couple of months. But it is a nice plant that stays fairly green throughout the year. So even now at the end of a long dry season, it's a reasonably attractive plant. Just don't lie down in it. Okay, we're standing by the creek bed of George F. Canyon. And as you can see, it's dry at this time of year. And this is really an indication of our climate here locally. We have a weird climate where it's wet during the cool part of the year in a good year and dry most of the rest of the year. So we haven't had really any measurable rain for close to 8 months. So the surface of the creek bed is dry, but we still have groundwater, which is why we have this green vegetation all around us. And this is a challenge around the peninsula for wildlife. We have riparian areas like this where there is still at least moisture available to willows and other plants in the riparian area. But as you go up the sides of the slopes, we'll see some points further up the stream where it's very dry already, where there's very little vegetation, very little you can see that's green. And the plants and animals have to adapt to that seasonality in ways that's very different from the plants and animals that live, let's say, in Louisiana or someplace where there's moisture available year-round. Much of the world that is seasonal, too, gets most of their rainfall during the warmer parts of the year and less during the cooler part of the year. So our climate, what's called the Mediterranean climate, is particularly distinctive in this pattern. Only about 6% of the planet's surface has this climate that experiences most of its precipitation during the cooler part of the year. And plants like the lemonade berry here and the sagebrush have adapted to this climate, but there are other introduced plants that require lots of irrigation because they're not naturally adapted to this climate. So we don't see too many of those non-native plants here in George F. Canyon, although there are some. Okay, the canyon walls here in George F. Canyon are a mix of shales from seafloor sediment and then much older rock that's Catalina Schist, which we'll see more of later. But all along the floor of the canyon, there are chunks of various sizes, from boulders down to smaller rocks, of the schist that have been washed down here over the millennia. And one of the interesting things that you can do with the schist, sometimes if you put a little water on it makes it much more attractive. So Cindy's brought some water, and we'll see if we get much color. Well,
Oh, there's a
we're getting a little bit of
bright blue.
bluish color there, but the schist much of it is blue schist or green schist. So it's not showing up too well here in the shadow in the bottom of the creek bed. But this is ancient rock. This rock formed when there were dinosaurs walking the surface of the earth. And almost all of California was on the seafloor back then. But this is obviously now elevated above sea level, and we can play games with it.
Now, this Catalina schist forms the bedrock of the Los Angeles Basin, but is only visible here at the George F. Canyon.
On the mainland, yeah, there are plenty of exposures out on Catalina Island, which is why it's called Catalina Schist. But even though it underlies the entire Los Angeles Basin and everything from here out to sea, and is actually part of the same geological formation that you find up the coast, up to San Francisco and further north from there, called the Monterey Formation. But here in the Los Angeles Basin, it's mostly covered with hundreds or even thousands of feet of sediment, of shale and other seafloor material, and then even some terrestrial sediment washed down from the San Gabriels and Santa Monica Mountains. But because the peninsula has been pushed up, the materials like the schist, which would be much deeper down in the rest of the Los Angeles Basin, it's been thrust up and exposed here in George F. Canyon. So again, this is the only place on the mainland of North America where you can see this rock, Catalina Schist. This is a great spot to see some of the history of George F. Canyon. We've got the Catalina Schist in some of the darker rock that you can see on the canyon bottom here. But if you look at the side of the wash here, you can see it's just a jumble of other rocks, mostly shales. And the reason for that is as the creek, as the stream bed has dug down, eaten into the rock, it's made the sides of the canyon steeper and steeper the further down it's cut. And as the sides got steeper, they started to slide. There were landslides and rock slides. So what we've got here on the side is just a jumble of rocks that have fallen down in different landslides and rock slides over who knows how many thousands of years since the peninsula emerged from the ocean. So in other areas, for example, some of the sea cliffs that we have adjacent to the ocean, you can see nice, neat parallel strata of shale that are lying essentially as they've been deposited. But these rocks here have been degraded and decomposed, and again, because of the downcutting of the creek here, it's caused rock slides, and we end up not with the nice, neat parallel layer cake of rocks, but with this, just melange of stuff thrown together. So that's part of the story of the geology of the peninsula. Okay, here we have a specimen that we don't see too much on the peninsula, but which is widespread in Southern California. This stuff here that looks like not much of anything, it's actually a dormant plant called Dodder, or witch's hair, and it's parasitic. It's a plant that grows out of other plants, and it's growing here on this, I guess this must be a dying toyon. You can see a bit more back there on a live toyon, but this plant is not too picky about hosts. It can grow on a number of different kinds of plants, and it just sends its roots into the tissue of the plant, sucks out its sap, and lives off of that, produces little bitty flowers, and again, while it's in its active phase, it's a pale green. It's dormant here, and this is essentially dead branches and leaves. But it may come back, and if this one doesn't, others will. And it will come back as a stringy-looking plant, not coming out of the ground, but growing out of a host plant as a parasite. So it's not just animals that are parasites, like ticks. Plants can be parasites too. This time of year, many people get mistletoe and hang it somewhere in a hallway or something like that. Mistletoe is another parasite. It grows out of host plants, doesn't set roots into the ground at all, but derives its nutrients primarily from its host. It does photosynthesize a bit more than Dodder, but the plant world, like the animal world, does have its share of parasites. One of California's native trees is the cherry in the genus Prunis. The most widespread variety is Prunis alisofolia, and the alisofolia refers to the fact that it's got these teeth around the perimeter of the leaf, which the Latin alisofolia refers to. On the Channel Islands, particularly Catalina, there's a subspecies of Prunis alisofolia called Catalina cherry, which is Prunis alisofolia variety lyonii. And this is an example of that. You can see these leaves have very little in the way of teeth around the edges, and all of the Channel Islands have cherries with this kind of pattern. Interestingly enough, the peninsula is one of very few places on the mainland that have the island or Catalina type cherry, and this is relevant because Palos Verdes used to be a Channel Island before sediment filled in the space between what's now the peninsula and the mainland of North America. So we have several other plants that are also found on the Channel Islands and on the Palos Verdes Peninsula, and on few or no other places on the mainland other than the Palos Verdes Peninsula. So that's Catalina cherry.
Well, it's very clear in looking at these trunks and branches that these are not the same variety of tree. We're used to considering poison oak as something that's a low-lying shrub, But in fact, what we have here is a poison oak that is overgrown and has engulfed this willow tree. And as you look up around it, you'll see that the smaller branches of poison oak are strangling the willow tree. This is a tree you don't want to climb. If you were to climb the branches of the trunk or branches of the poison oak, you would be sorry later on.
One of the interesting things to see here is the contrast between the lemonade berry, which is an evergreen. So we've got an exposure of evergreen across the canyon here, but further around the bend here, where it's more directly southward facing, you see one of the effects of our latitude. We are about 32 degrees north of the equator, which means that anything south facing like this is in the sun all day, whereas the slope on the other side of the canyon is north facing and gets less sunlight. So generally on the north facing side of a canyon like this, there's less evaporation, the vegetation tends to be greener, and on south facing sides like we've got across the way there, because it's exposed to the sun all day long, it tends to get dried out sooner in the year and to have vegetation that's more adapted to those dry conditions. So we can see over there, it's mostly sagebrush and buckwheat, but it's dormant. It's gone to sleep for the dry season and will turn greener in the next couple of months, hoping that we get some rainfall. But that's one of the many climate factors that our native flora and fauna have to adapt to. And that exposure over there is one illustration of that feature. Okay, here we see an exposure of the Catalina schist, and each one of these layers represents probably thousands of years. This is a rock that formed on the seafloor back during the Cretaceous, when it was metamorphosed, and the rocks are actually older than that. So each one of these is a page out of prehistory that may extend back well over 100,000 years ago, before there were T-Rexes on the planet. And then they were metamorphosed again about 90 million years ago while they were still on the seafloor. And then since that time, the peninsula has gradually come up, particularly in the last few million years.
We are at what was formerly Trail's End of George F. Canyon, and there is a peekaboo view of the LA Basin out from here. But we encourage you to go another short distance up to the expansive viewpoint at the trail extension. But right next to this sign, at the former Trail's End, we have a toyon bush that you'll see all throughout the George F. Canyon, with its prominent red berries, which you see it's in around Christmas time, or December, January timeframe. That gives it its nickname, Christmas berry. Here is the reward that you get at Trail's End: an expansive view all the way across the Los Angeles Basin out to the San Gabriel and San Bernardino mountains.
We've reached the end of our walk for this afternoon, and we hope you've all enjoyed the adventure. This land that we're on right now is land that was added by contributions from members of the community, and the Palos Verdes Peninsula Land Conservancy depends on the community for financial support as well as for volunteers. And in fact, we get about 20,000 volunteer hours per year to help us carry out our activities, both in terms of habitat restoration, our education programs, our community outreach, and a range of other programs that we have, services that we offer. So we'd like to invite you to visit our website, pvplc.org, for Palos Verdes Peninsula Land Conservancy, and it lists the programs that we offer, has a calendar of activities, and special activities and fundraising events like our film series. And the graphics that you see on the screen now will tell you how you can find out more about that. Thanks for joining us, and we'll hope to see you on the trail.